Let's dive into 7 key differences between communication styles in the United States and Brazil. Knowing what they are and how to navigate them could help you in your personal and professional lives. I've evenly split the last 28 years of my life living and working in Brazil and the United States. Even if you never speak a word of a foreign language, it's worth taking a few minutes to explore how culture impacts communication. It's true that people in the US are more direct and explicit in their communications than Brazilians. Why? Someone who is described as independent or highly independent in the US is likely being praised for their autonomy, strong convictions, grit, commitment, or willingness to stand up for an idea. Brazilians, on the other hand, take an indirect, non-confrontational approach to things. Someone described as independente or muito independente is probably thought of as a loner and not as a team player. I grew up in the US with a natural, unquestioning understanding that the terms rugged individual and independent thinker were universally positive. Shortly after moving to Brazil at 24, I was surprised to learn that calling someone independent without further explaining could be a negative. Quantifying cultural attributes is not an exact science. It can be helpful though. The cross-cultural research of a Dutch psychologist and former IBM executive ranked the United States the most individualistic among 78 countries. Its score of 91 compares with a score of 38 for Brazil. Brazil was found to be less individualistic than 42 countries and more individualistic than 34. So what do these findings look like in real life? Differences in directness and indirectness were really driven home for me on a 45-minute planning call that I moderated between engineering professors at the University of Sao Paulo and Harvard. None of the participants on the call had met each other, and this was before the time of Zoom or Google Meets, so we were huddled around 2 distant speakerphones. Although they had never traveled to Brazil, the engineering professors from Harvard took an assertive approach. The Brazilian professors, who had 70 years of directly relevant confined experience, mostly sat back and let their foreign counterparts take the lead. I have to say that I was somewhat embarrassed by the less informed faculty from my home country jumping into the driver's seat, and I was a bit frustrated that the local experts passively sat back and let that happen. At the end of our conversation, one of the Harvard professors summarized the key points and asked if that was right. The Brazilian professors responded yes, but I knew 2 things at the end of that call. First, the Brazilian professors had verbally agreed. Second, their hand motions and the confused expressions on their faces meant that they did not, in fact, agree. For anyone who spent time in Brazil and the US, most would agree that Brazil feels more relaxed and informal. There are important exceptions. I will never forget the time I watched one Brazilian congressman shouting at another on TV Senado, "Vossa Excelência é uma canalha desgraçada." The mix of formality and furor were foreign, frightening, and entertaining to me at the same time. I couldn't decide if I was more surprised by how much the congressmen were verbally disrespecting each other, or by the excessively respectful titles they were using to do so. I will also never forget sitting through my first composição de mesa. It lasted 20 minutes that I felt was an eternity. By the time the event actually started, everyone in the audience had been reminded countless times how important each speaker was because of his or her, mostly his, title and position. Instead of everyone starting on the stage or inviting the panel up as a group, speakers were called up one by one. Anyone who didn't know what estimado, magnífico, professor doutor, ilustre, or prestigiado meant had the perfect opportunity to learn. I'd never seen anything like it. On the flip side, I've watched Brazilians understandably at a loss for words when they witness Americans who have known each other for decades and haven't seen each other in months or years coldly greet one another with a handshake or just a nod from across the room. I loved and lived with my stepfather for 25 years before he died. It took him 15 years to get comfortable just giving me a hug. Working in Brazil, I have mentally noted the many times Brazilian colleagues would have been severely disciplined or even fired for off-color jokes on the job. What is encouraged, laughed at, or tolerated in Brazil could easily lead to a negative review, firing, or even a lawsuit in the US. Most often, the problems related to jokes involve gender, race, or ethnicity. Some of the examples made me wish we were less sensitive and politically correct in the US. Others really made me cringe. Regardless of who or what you think is right, understand that differences in formality are real and can have very negative consequences. Often, the most dangerous mistakes can be the ones you don't even know you made.